The scripture will be on the screens ahead of you. Stand in honor of God's word as we read it together. The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. For tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and rolled it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up so that his hands remained steadfast until the sun set. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. And then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." How many of you remember growing up, "You dun 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 dun, his banner over me is love"? You remember that song? I can't remember how that thing started. That song probably comes from this passage right here. May the children of God be seated, and the shorter children can be dismissed to children's time. The children of Israel were on their way to a land that was promised them by the Lord. We call it, the Promised Land. Let's go back a little bit and kind of remember how they got into this circumstance they're in as this passage is being read. They had been imprisoned for 400 years in Egypt because they had gone to Egypt during a famine so they would survive. But everything they did, everything they touched just worked out toward the good, and they prospered and multiplied. And the people of Egypt got concerned that Israel would take over Egypt, and so the Israelites were put into slavery. And for 400 years, they were slaves in Egypt. Moses was born during this time when all of the newborn male children were put to death. But he was hidden and ended up going into Pharaoh's house because Pharaoh's daughter found him at the riverside and brought him home and protected him. And Moses grew up and became a great leader of the Israelite slaves in Egypt. You might remember at the end of that time, God spoke to Moses and told him to go speak with Pharaoh and tell them to let my people go. And Pharaoh said no. So there was a series of plagues that led to their release from Egypt. And Pharaoh said, just leave. You've caused enough trouble here. And so the Israelites left. They got right to the Red Sea when suddenly they saw the dust off in the future. Pharaoh had changed his mind, and horsemen and charioteers and swordsmen and people with bows were chasing them down to annihilate them, and they didn't know what they were going to do. They couldn't move forward because of the Great Sea. They couldn't go back into bondage because that meant certain death. And you know what happened? God parted the Red Sea, and they went through on dry land. And as soon as they got to the other side, and the Egyptians thought to themselves, well, if they can do it, it's good enough for us. And they went down into the bedrock of the Red Sea, and God caused the water to come back together and stopped them. And the children of Israel were on their way to the Promised Land. They roamed around in the desert for 40 years. Tens and hundreds of thousands of them, a huge nation of people headed toward the Promised Land. There was nothing to drink out there in the desert. There was nothing to eat. So you recall how God caused manna to drop from heaven, and it would be with the dew every morning, and they ate manna. How they must have gotten sick and tired of manna. But in the desert, God fed them all those years. And on various occasions when there was no water to be had, God said to Moses, touch this stone and water will flow from it. And inside that mountain, water reserved from rains gone by, he would touch it where God told him to touch it, and the sediment would drop that had dried and looked like stone itself. But sure enough, water would flow from the rock where God told him to touch it. And on several occasions, they were miraculously spared as God told Moses where to hit the stone. Eventually, God said, just speak to the stone and water will flow. Well, Moses kind of made a mistake there because God told him just to speak that time. And he hit it like he had in the past. And God was upset with Moses, for Moses hadn't done what God had told Moses to do. Water came from the rock and manna from heaven, and they were spared over and over again. They're almost to the promised land when they're attacked by the people of that region. They were almost home when the Amalekites attacked. The Amalekites were named after Amalek himself, and Amalek was distantly related to the children of Israel. You go back a few generations, and he was his people were the son of a concubine that was connected to the children of Israel, so they were step cousins. They were distantly related. But the Amalekites knew that God had promised Israel a promised land, that he would make them as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the beaches near all of the seas of the world. They knew the promise that God was getting ready to do something great with the children of Israel. But Amalek was against God's plan, and so he raised up an army and he attacked the Israelites when they were weak. They knew the promise that God had been made to Abraham. They were essentially attacking God and God's plan by attacking the Israelites. And so in verse 14, you see something that to our ears seems a little harsh. God said he was going to destroy the Amalekites and wipe their memory off the face of the earth. Why? Because number one, the Amalekites were opposing what they knew to be God's will for the children of Israel. And in addition to that, the Amalekites came up from behind the children of Israel as they traveled. And those hundreds of thousands of people that were traveling, the children were lagging behind. The old and the sick were at the back of the line. And the Amalekites were picking off the weak ones of the children of Israel, unmercifully sacrificing them as the Israelites were headed toward freedom and the promised land. So elderly Moses, by this time, who had lived many, many years and was no longer strong like he was back when Charleston Heston was in charge of things. Moses was older, and there was a battle getting ready to happen. And so Moses said, Joshua, you're to lead our army as we attack the Amalekites. And he led two of his leaders. Moses led two of his leaders up on top of the mountainside. And once again, as he had done before, Moses raised his staff so that everyone could see, this is the staff that has given us water from the rocks. This is the staff that has fed us. This is a reminder to us that God is on our side. Moses held out his staff as a sign of God's power, the same staff that he had used through the years to remind the children of Israel, God is with us. Do not be afraid. And in this battle that we waged all day long and maybe into the night and over several days for all we know, when Moses lifted up his staff, the Israelites prevailed and they cheered, and the soldiers would look up on the mountaintop and see Moses standing there. They could see that staff that had brought water from the rock, and they could see Moses who had led them to freedom. It was almost theirs, but Moses is old. You try holding your hands with a weight of any kind over your head for any length of time, and you know what happens. It starts to hurt. And Moses would drop that staff a little bit, and the battle would go against them. And the Amalekites began to win the day. He'd drop his staff, and the Amalekites prevailed. He'd raise his staff again, trying to hold it up as best he could, and the Israelites would win. I'm sure some of it is supernatural. And some of it's just psychological. When they could see that staff, they were reminded God was on their side. When they couldn't see the staff, when Moses looked weak, they felt weak, and the battle would go in a different direction. And as the battle lingered, Moses grew weary. Soldiers in the field would glance up, and they couldn't see the staff. They couldn't see Moses, and they would give up hope in the middle of this battle. So Aaron and Hur rolled a stone underneath Moses so he could sit. And that helped a little bit. They could see Moses, but where's the staff? And so they lifted up his arms and held his arms with the staff in it until the battle was over. Eventually, the Amalekites were defeated. Their people were wiped from the face of the earth because they had challenged God's authority, knowing what God had in mind for the children of Israel. God made sure they were defeated. Israel defeated its foes by lifting each other up in a time of crisis. That's what I want to talk to you about today. You can find some wonderful preaching on the television. It makes us preachers a little nervous when you tell us the great sermon you saw on the television, because you know they only put the really best preachers on television, right? So you can hear some mighty good preaching on the television. And now you can do it on YouTube and on and on and on. You can hear a huge crowd by turning on the Crystal Cathedral or whatever happens to be on Sunday morning. My mama used to listen to 4-part gospel singer quartets on Sunday morning as we got ready for church. Did you ever do that? Listening to some of the finest singing, that guy that smiled all the time, whatever. He was in the Jordanaires for a little while, you know. He smiled all the time. He sang real high. And Mom would get all pumped up before we ever got to Sunday school and church. And then we'd go to church and we'd hear Beethoven. And we'd hear some preacher who was kind of older and tireder. And I'm thinking, you know, Billy Graham was better early on. Today you'd say that, you know, Dan can't hold a candle to Joel Osteen. And that's probably right, you know. You put the best preachers on television. You put the best choirs on television. You can find some wonderful worship on television, radio, and other media. But we all need somebody close to lift us up when times are hard. You can write the Billy Graham Association, and even though Billy's in heaven, you can still get a response to prayer requests from the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. But when you go into the local hospital, as most people would do, they go to the local hospital. Greg just smiled a little bit. When you go to the local hospital, Billy Graham has never shown up in Louisa to pray with you. But others have. You need somebody close and at hand to pray with you in times of struggle, to give you hugs in times of pain and grief and despair. When you need help in ministry around here, somebody from some TV ministry won't show up in the kitchen to scramble those eggs. We call one of you, like Heather yesterday, frying up those eggs, and Lee was making bacon as hard as he could go, and sausage and some mighty fine gravy. Lee Arrington makes some mighty fine gravy and put them on some fine biscuits. I've never known any TV preacher to show up in Louisa and make gravy for you and me. Can be done. From a distance, they can preach a fine sermon. From a distance, they can sing a wonderful song. But what we really need when we're hurting is somebody who knows us and loves us, to lift us up and bear the weight of the troubles in our life. What we need when we're sending out mission trips is somebody to open up their wallet and pay some money into a fund so Lawrence and his crew can go off to Guatemala and make such a difference in Guatemala. I was so proud of you when your daughter stood up and says, I need $1,000 to go on this mission trip, and within an hour and a half, it was completely funded by her friends here at this church. That's the power of the local church. The way we lift up each other in difficult times so that all of us can succeed in ministry. The world is so often tearing itself down. I don't listen to talk radio much anymore. I don't listen to the news channels as much as I used to. I used to try to keep up with world events. You know, I woke up this morning and I was sitting on the edge of the tub deciding whether I was going to shave the beard off or not. And the thought occurred to me the world could have come to an end while I was sleeping last night. And the only way I know it didn't is because I'm still here. There's no telling what might have happened in the world last night. And something terrible might have been on the news this morning. I have no idea what might be going on in the world. Because it's hard to turn on the news and hear how we treat each other in this world. The world is so good at tearing people down. But you and I are called by the Lord Himself to lift each other up. Like Aaron and Hur, who took elderly Moses and kept those arms up so the army below would know God is with us. We can do this because we're doing it together. So I ask you this question. Who needs your encouragement today? Who is at the end of their rope? And maybe they've got a smile on their face. It is church. But who needs some encouragement from you today? Who needs some holding up, either in prayer or just a smile from you, someone to listen? You know, sometimes there's no words that we can say that can fix the problems that another person has. And in the darkest days of my life, there is nothing anyone can say that can take the pain away. But at the very worst times in my life, God has always given me somebody to do nothing more than put their arms around me and cry with me until the pain was eased. Theologians call that a ministry of presence, and it is no small thing. When somebody that loves you lets you know you are not alone, they are pulling for you. They are lifting you up. So who needs you? Jesus was a master at lifting people up. And I encourage you to fill your days being the strength that other people need. Somebody else can't do that. Some church on the other side of the country, some church in Huntington can't do your ministry for you as well as you can do it. Jesus scoops us up in His arms when the pain is so great. And you'll notice in that picture, if you can see in that picture, the one who's broken by life has a hammer in his hands. For in this picture, this man was the one who drove the nails into Jesus' hands and His feet. But still there's mercy and there's grace as God lifts us up. So find ways, brothers and sisters. Find a way to minister to each other. Don't wait for someone to minister to you. It may or may not happen. Their ministry might not be what it needs to be. You're not responsible for your brother's ministry. You're accountable for your own. Lift one another up and carry the burden and be the beautiful feet that bring hope to a friend. Lord Jesus, so often we wait to be ministered to. Raise up these friends of mine, these men and women of faith, and may we be known as the church who ministers to others. Those that we are expected to minister to surely, and in a special way, those that no one thought to love. Teach us, Lord, how to lift each other up. For on the night that Jesus was betrayed, He gathered together in the upper room with His disciples. And after the